The gavel came down so hard that Valentina Moreau felt the vibration through the marble floor beneath her feet, and still she did not flinch. "You will produce the evidence now, human, or this court will proceed with the sentence." The voice belonged to Lord Seraphon Vale, the chief arbiter of the immortal court of the Eastern Dominion, and it carried the particular kind of contempt that only 400 years of uncontested authority could manufacture. He was white-haired, pale as polished bone, with eyes the color of deep winter frost, and he wore his disdain like a second formal robe. Duke Malachi Dunraven has been tried under Blood Law Article 19, subsection 4. The evidence against him is irrefutable. His execution is scheduled for dawn tomorrow, when the Eastern Gallery shutters are removed and the sun enters this very chamber. Valentina stood at the advocate's podium in the center of the circular court, surrounded by 17 vampire lords and ladies seated in ascending rows of dark mahogany and black marble. The chamber was buried 60 feet beneath a converted cathedral in the heart of modern London, and it smelled of old stone and older power. Above her, imprisoned behind a cage of reinforced iron and spelled glass, Duke Malachi Dunraven stood with his hands in restraints and his white hair falling across his forehead in a way that made something unbearable move through her chest. He was watching her, not with hope exactly, more like a man who had accepted his fate but could not quite stop looking at the last beautiful thing he expected to see before it was taken from him. "I am not stalling," Valentina said, and her voice was clear and completely steady. "I am presenting my case in the correct procedural order as outlined by the court's own advocate charter of 1887. If this court chooses to skip evidentiary procedure because it is inconvenient, it may do so, but the record will reflect that departure." There was a murmur through the chamber. Several of the assembled lords shifted in their seats. The advocate charter was one of those ancient documents that everyone acknowledged, but very few had actually read, because it had been written when the court still permitted human advocates, which was a practice that had been quietly discouraged for the past century and a half. The fact that Valentina had not only read it, but had memorized it, had been doing things to the court's composure since she had first appeared 3 days ago, and correctly cited 17 separate procedural rules that the prosecution had violated. Lord Seraphon set down his gavel with deliberate, controlled patience. "You have requested 4 procedural continuances, human. You have cited obscure charter provisions and demanded original documentation for every piece of evidence the prosecution has submitted. You have questioned the chain of custody on items held in this court's own vault for 200 years. The court is not blind to what you are doing. The court is welcome to its conclusions." Valentina said, "But I would remind this assembly that a conclusion is not the same as evidence, and a suspicion is not a verdict." From the cage above she heard something. It was barely a sound at all, more a catch of breath, and she did not look up because she could not afford to. She had learned 3 days ago that looking at Malachi Dunraven made it harder to think, and she needed every single thought she possessed right now. "This court grants you one final opportunity," Lord Seraphon said, and the frost in his voice had thickened considerably. "Produce your exculpatory evidence, or withdraw your advocacy, and allow proceedings to conclude." Valentina reached into the leather document case at her feet, and she took out a document that she had carried from a private archive in Prague, to a solicitor's vault in Vienna, to a courier's sealed box, to this exact moment, and she set it on the podium. The room went so silent that she could hear her own heartbeat. The document was written on vellum that had darkened to a deep amber over the centuries. The ink was still sharp, still legible, sealed with a wax impression that bore the mark of the sovereign blood compact, the highest authority in the entirety of vampire civilization, whose edicts superseded even this court's jurisdiction. This, Valentina said, and she was careful to keep all emotion out of her voice, even as her hands shook almost imperceptibly, is the Dunraven Compact Pardon, dated April the 14th, 1691, signed and sealed by the then-ruling Sovereign Compact Authority, Lady Esvain Thorold, in perpetuity. It explicitly pardons any and all members of the Dunraven bloodline from prosecution under Blood Law Article 19 for acts committed in defense of a bonded human ward. The document has never been revoked. Under Article 3 of the Sovereign Compact's own foundational statutes, it cannot be superseded by any lower court ruling. The silence in that chamber became a living thing. Lord Seraphon's frost-pale eyes moved from the document to Valentina's face and back to the document, and for the first time in 3 days, he looked not contemptuous, but genuinely unsettled. "Where," he said very carefully, "did you obtain that document?" "I am a history teacher, my lord," Valentina said. "I teach early modern history at University College London. I have spent the last 3 years researching the foundational documents of vampire civil governance, most of which are, I should note, kept in entirely unguarded archives because no one has bothered to read them for 200 years. She looked up at him with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who had spent those 3 years preparing for exactly this moment. "I did not stall," she said. "I was waiting for this. The past 4 months had begun. As most extraordinary things in Valentina Moreau's life seemed to do, with a problem she had not asked for and could not ignore. She had been 31 years old when a student in her Tuesday evening continuing education seminar on the history of pre-modern European governance had started asking questions so specific, so pointed, and so deeply knowledgeable about vampire court structures that she had stayed after class to ask him where he was getting his research. He had told her his name was Dorian, which was almost certainly not true, and that he was asking on behalf of someone who did not have the luxury of doing their own research. He had also explained, very calmly and matter-of-factly, that the person he represented was a vampire duke who had been placed under court arrest 8 months earlier, and was awaiting trial for a crime that had, in point of legal fact, never been a crime at all. Valentina had taught European governance history for 7 years. She had written 2 books on the intersection of human and non-human political structures in early modern Europe, both of which had been published to modest academic acclaim and absolutely zero mainstream attention. She knew more about vampire court law than most vampires did, simply because vampires, as it turned out, were not particularly interested in reading their own history. They preferred to live it in the particular way that immortal beings developed habits, which was to say, they developed them slowly and abandoned them almost never. She had gone home that night, opened the 3rd drawer of her filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder she had kept for 2 years and never quite known what to do with. The folder contained photocopies of documents she had found during an archive residency in Prague. They were documents that had been misfiled in a box of routine trade agreements, and she had recognized them for what they were because she had spent the previous 6 months reading everything ever written about the Sovereign Blood Compact, which was the vampire equivalent of a constitutional authority, and which had been, for all practical purposes, presumed dissolved after its last sovereign regent died without her named successor in 1743. The documents had not been dissolved. They had been misfiled. She had written 2 letters to the Vampire Court's Public Liaison Office, informing them of her findings, and both letters had gone unanswered. She had eventually concluded that either no one in the court's administrative apparatus had read the letters, or someone had read them and decided that making them disappear was preferable to acting on them. When Dorian had sat across from her in an empty university seminar room and described the legal situation surrounding Duke Malachi Dunraven, she had known within approximately 45 seconds that the misfiled Prague documents were the answer to a problem that had not yet fully declared itself to her. That had been 4 months ago. The meeting with Malachi himself had come 6 weeks later, after she had agreed to take the case, and Dorian had arranged for her to be escorted to the place where the Duke was being held under house arrest, a penthouse apartment in a converted Victorian warehouse in Southwark that had all of its windows fitted with UV-blocking glass and electronic shutters, and which was, on the outside, completely indistinguishable from any of the expensive residential conversions that had colonized that part of London in the last decade. She had expected arrogance. She had read the file that Dorian had given her with extraordinary thoroughness, and the picture it painted of Duke Malachi Dunraven was not a comfortable one. He was 640 years old, turned during the Black Death, when he had been a human lord of 23, and he had spent the subsequent 6 centuries being powerful, ruthless, politically brilliant, and deeply disinterested in anyone's comfort except his own. His name appeared in 3 centuries of Vampire Court records as a figure of considerable authority, occasional mercies, and absolute, immovable will. He was not a figure who invited sympathy. He was also, she had discovered from the court documents Dorian had provided, currently in trouble, because he had killed 4 vampires who had attacked a 14-year-old girl in an alley behind a Southwark music venue. And the 4 vampires he had killed had belonged to a bloodline with significant court representation, whose surviving members had used that representation to bring charges against him under Blood Law Article 19, which prohibited unauthorized killing of vampire citizens. The girl was alive. She had given a statement to a human police liaison officer, and had no idea she had been saved by one of the oldest vampires in Western Europe. She was now studying for her GCSEs, and had no involvement in what was happening in the court 60 feet beneath London's streets. Valentina had known, from the moment she read the case, that this was wrong. Not legally wrong, necessarily, because Blood Law Article 19 was real, and it had been applied correctly in a formal sense, but wrong in the way that things were wrong when systems designed to produce justice were used as weapons to produce something else entirely. She had gone to meet Malachi Dunraven with the intention of being entirely professional and thoroughly unaffected. He had been standing at the window of the penthouse when she was shown in, looking out at the UV-blocked version of the London skyline, and she had stopped 2 steps into the room, because the sight of him had done something to the air around her in a way she had no vocabulary. For he was tall, with the particular kind of presence that came not from physical size, but from the compression of centuries into a single human-shaped form. His hair was white, not the white of age, but the deep, pure white of vampire transformation, and it fell to his shoulders with the effortless quality of something that had never been required to be anything other than exactly what it was. His skin was pale, luminous in the way of very old vampires, who had accumulated enough power that their physicality had become almost abstract, and his eyes, when he turned to look at her, were the color of dark amber shot through with gold. He looked at her, and she had the disorienting sensation of being read by someone who had spent 600 years learning how to read people, and who found the experience of doing so neither threatening nor remarkable. "You are the history teacher," he said. "Valentina Moreau," she said. "Yes, you are younger than I expected." He said it without particular inflection, and she recognized it not as a compliment or a criticism, but as a simple observation from someone who had been processing information about her and was now updating it. "You are exactly as old as the documents suggest," she said, "which means you have had 640 years to learn how courts work. So perhaps you can tell me why, in all of that time, no one on your behalf has ever read the Prague archive." Something shifted in his face, not surprise, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Something she would later identify as the particular expression of a person encountering a quality in another person that they had not anticipated and were not yet certain how to categorize. "Tell me about Prague," he said. She had told him about Prague. They had talked for 4 hours. It was nothing like what she had expected. She had come prepared for the distance of a formal professional consultation, and instead she had found herself sitting across a coffee table from a 600-year-old vampire who asked questions with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, not just to be informed, and who listened to her answers with the kind of total attention that she had always found both rare and, she was discovering, dangerously compelling. He asked her about her research, not politely, not performatively, but with the real curiosity of someone who had lived through the periods she studied, and who found it simultaneously strange and fascinating to hear them described from the outside. She asked him questions in return, because she was incapable of sitting across from a primary source and not asking questions. And he answered them with a directness that was occasionally startling, as when he confirmed that yes, the court had been aware of the Sovereign Compact's theoretical survival and had made a policy decision to proceed as though it had dissolved, on the grounds that acknowledging its authority would have required restructuring 2 centuries of accumulated power. "That is extraordinary," she said. "That is the most brazen institutional bad faith I have encountered in 7 years of studying vampire legal history." "You study vampire legal history specifically," he said. "I wrote a book about it. 2, actually, I know. I read them." She had looked at him then, and he had been watching her with that amber and gold gaze that made it very difficult to think about anything except the fact that it was directed at her, and she had thought, with the particular clarity of someone who had just been given very important information, that this was a problem she had not adequately prepared for. She had driven home in her ancient and deeply unremarkable Nissan, and sat in the driver's seat outside her flat for 10 minutes before going inside, and she had not allowed herself to examine why. The following months had been a concentrated exercise in parallel processes. There was the legal process, which required her to file formal advocacy documents with the court, obtain certified translations of the Prague materials, establish chain of custody through a series of European archives, and navigate the Byzantine procedural requirements of a court system that had been designed in the 17th century and updated approximately never. There was the personal process, which required her to visit Malachi regularly for consultations and to maintain an entirely professional demeanor throughout those visits, while he looked at her with those amber eyes and asked her about her research, and occasionally, very quietly, told her things about his own history that she was fairly certain he had never told anyone. He told her about being turned. He told her about the first century after turning, which he described as the longest and most disorienting period of his existence, not because of the physical changes, but because of the experience of watching every human being he had known before his transformation die, one by one, while he remained. He told her about the political structures of the court in their early centuries, about the alliances and betrayals, and the accumulating weight of power in a system that never cleared itself out through mortality. He told her about the girl in the alley, not as a legal matter, but as a human one, which surprised her until she realized that Malachi Dunraven had been human once, and had never quite finished being that, no matter how long ago it was. She reminded me of someone, he said, during a consultation 2 months into the process. Who? My younger sister. She died in 1348. He said it simply, without the self-conscious drama that a human telling such a story might employ, because 6 centuries had not made the loss smaller, but had made the carrying of it something he had learned to do without collapsing under the weight. I could not save her. I did not save anyone I was supposed to protect. So now, when I encounter a situation I am able to affect, I act even when it costs you this much, she said. Especially then, he said, or it doesn't mean anything. She had looked at her notes then very deliberately, because looking at her notes was something she could do without the risk of him seeing on her face the thing that was happening inside her chest when he spoke. She had thought, very clearly, that she was in significant trouble. The day the trial formally began, Valentina wore her best suit, a dark navy one that she had bought for a conference at Cambridge 3 years earlier, and carried her leather document case with the organized precision of someone who had spent 4 months preparing for exactly this. She walked into the court chamber with the focused calm of someone who understood that the next several days would require her to be the most competent version of herself she had ever been. The prosecution was led by Lord Casaveth Morn, a vampire of some 300 years, who had the kind of beautiful, razor-edged face that belonged on a Renaissance altarpiece, and who had clearly not prepared for the possibility that a human advocate would know the court's own procedural rules better than the court did. The first day of the trial had involved Valentina citing 7 separate procedural violations in the prosecution's opening submissions, each one documented with references so specific that Casaveth Morn had to confer with his legal scholars twice before confirming that she was in fact correct. She had felt Malachi watching her from the cage throughout. She had not looked at him, not once, because she understood that looking at him would compromise the professional distance she was maintaining with considerable effort. She had heard him that first day when Lord Seraphon called a brief recess and the chamber's formal silence lifted, in the relative murmur of vampire lords consulting with their advisers. She had heard his voice from above, low and deliberate, carrying just to her. "You are the most remarkable person in this room," he said, "by a considerable margin. I am the only person in this room who is not going to live forever," she said very quietly, her eyes on her notes. "So I intend to be very efficient with the time I have." She had heard something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly controlled, and then the gavel had come down and the session had resumed. Now, on the 4th day, with the Dunraven compact pardon on the podium in front of her and the entire assembled court. In a silence that had taken on the quality of held breath, Valentina waited. Lord Seraphon had dispatched 2 of his court scholars to examine the document the moment she placed it before them, and they had been huddled over it for 12 minutes, consulting reference texts and speaking to each other in rapid, very quiet vampire dialect, and the longer they conferred, the more the assembled lords shifted and murmured, and the more the quality of the silence changed from suppressed contempt to something significantly more complicated. Lord Casaveth Morn was very still at the prosecution's podium. He had the particular stillness of someone who had been extremely confident 30 minutes ago and was now doing rapid internal calculations about how bad this was going to be. "For him, my lord," one of the scholars said at last, straightening and turning to face Lord Seraphon with an expression that conveyed information she clearly found very uncomfortable to convey. "The document appears to be authentic. The seal matches the known impressions from Sovereign Regent Thorold's tenure. The vellum and ink composition are consistent with the period. The legal language is consistent with compact convention from the late 17th century. "Appears to be," Lord Seraphon said. "Is," the scholar said, and then added, with the audible reluctance of someone accepting an unpleasant truth, "My lord." The murmuring in the chamber became considerably louder. Valentina placed her hands flat on the podium and spoke into the noise. The Dunraven compact pardon was issued in response to an incident in 1691 in which Duke Malachi Dunraven killed 3 vampire aggressors who had attacked a human child under his ward. The Sovereign Regent issued the pardon in perpetuity to acknowledge that the act was lawful under compact authority, which supersedes blood law in cases where a bonded human ward is protected. The incident for which the Duke is currently charged is legally identical in nature. He protected a human who was being attacked. He was authorized by a document that this court failed to acknowledge, because no one in this institution has read their own foundational records in 200 years to do exactly what he did. The question of whether the compact authority remains valid, Lord Seraphon said, and there was a quality in his voice now that was less contemptuous and considerably more careful, is a matter that requires full scholarly review before this court can accept a pardon document as legally operative. The compact's authority is established by Article 3 of its own foundational statutes, which predate blood law by 60 years, Valentina said. It does not require this court's acceptance to be valid. It requires this court's compliance. The silence that followed that sentence was of a different quality, entirely from anything that had come before it. It was the silence of a room full of people who had heard something irreversible said aloud. She finally looked up. She looked up, and she looked at the cage, and she found Malachi already looking at her, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen there in all of the months she had known him. The amber gold eyes were entirely unguarded, and what was in them was not relief, though there was relief, and not gratitude, though there was that too. What she saw in his face was the particular, undefended expression of someone who has just realized something true about themselves, that they had been very carefully not looking at for a significant amount of time. She made herself look back at Lord Seraphon. "I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against Duke Malachi Dunraven," she said, "on the grounds of the Sovereign Compact Pardon, which is directly applicable, legally operative, and has been in existence throughout this entire proceeding." The court's failure to be aware of it does not diminish its authority. The deliberation took 3 hours. During those 3 hours, Valentina sat in an anteroom off the main chamber and did not allow herself to think about anything except the legal mechanics of what was happening, because thinking about anything else was a luxury she could not afford until this was finished. She drank 3 cups of coffee, provided by a court attendant who seemed unsure whether humans required different accommodations than vampires and had erred on the side of offering everything available. She reviewed her documentation one more time, not because she thought she had missed anything, but because having something to do with her hands was essential. Dorian came and sat next to her for a while without speaking, which she appreciated. Eventually, the court attendant returned and told her the court was ready to resume. She walked back into the chamber, and this time she looked up at the cage before she reached the podium. And Malachi was watching her with an expression that was composed and still and entirely focused on her, and she gave him the smallest possible nod, the kind of communication that people who have been working together in high-stakes situations develop, the kind that carries complete meaning in the space of a fraction of a second. He gave her the same nod back. She reached the podium and turned to face Lord Seraphon. "This court," he said, and the frost in his voice had become something more complicated, less contemptuous and more weighted. Having reviewed the submitted documentation and consulted with its own legal scholars on the matter of sovereign compact authority, finds that the Dunraven Compact Pardon of 1691 is indeed an authentic and legally operative document under foundational vampire civil law. He paused with the particular pause of a man saying something he has decided to say correct regardless of the personal cost. The charges against Duke Malachi Dunraven under Blood Law Article 19 are hereby dismissed. The Duke is released from all court restraint, effective immediately. The gavel came down. This time the vibration through the marble floor felt entirely different. The cage opened. Malachi descended from it with a kind of unhurried grace that was the product of 6 centuries of practiced composure, and the court fell back from him in the way that things fell back from objects that had been under enormous contained pressure and were no longer restrained. Several of the assembled lords affected the careful neutrality of people reconsidering their positions. Lord Casaveth Morn was looking at something on the wall to his left with great apparent interest. Malachi walked across the chamber floor to the advocate's podium, and he stopped in front of Valentina, and he looked at her with those amber and gold eyes that she had spent 4 months not quite letting herself look at directly for too long at a stretch. "You said you weren't stalling," he said. "I wasn't," she said. "You were waiting for exactly the right moment." "I needed them to be completely certain of their own conclusion before I produced the document," she said. "A court that has just been shown its own arrogance is more likely to comply with a ruling it cannot ignore than a court that was given the same information gently at the beginning." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are the most dangerous person I have ever met," he said very quietly, and there was nothing in his voice except complete sincerity. "And I have met several genuinely dangerous people." "I teach history," she said. "History is just accumulated danger." Something moved across his face. Something warm and open and entirely at odds with every description of him she had ever read in 6 centuries of court records. He reached out and picked up the document case that she had packed, with the same automatic thoroughness with which she did everything, and he held it and the gesture was so simply courteous, so utterly natural, that she did not know what to do with it. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said, assuming that dining in the company of someone who cannot eat anything on the menu does not strike you as too absurd. She had spent 4 months being professional and reasonable and maintaining appropriate distance, and she was very tired. And Malachi Dunraven was standing in front of her with her document case and the expression of someone who had just been given back his life and wanted to spend some portion of it in her company. And she had, over the course of 4 months of consultations, told him more about her own inner life than she had told anyone in years. And he had told her things that she was fairly certain he had not told another living person. "It strikes me as exactly right," she said. The restaurant he took her to was on the top floor of a converted Victorian warehouse on the other side of Southwark, which she was fairly certain was not a coincidence in terms of geography, and it was the kind of place where the lighting was low enough that you could say true things without feeling quite as exposed as you might in ordinary daylight. The menu was extraordinary, and she ate entirely too much of it, and Malachi ordered a glass of something that she did not ask about, because she had been in his company long enough to understand the practical logistics of his existence without needing everything explained. They did not talk about the trial, not for the first hour. They talked about other things, the way they had during the consultation months, the way that had started as professional debriefing and had gradually become something else that neither of them had named. And she was aware, sitting across the table from him in the low, warm light, that the professional reason for those conversations was now concluded, and these conversations were purely themselves. "You said you read my books," she said, "eventually. Before I met you," he said. "I had Dorian find them after he told me about the seminar. I wanted to understand what kind of person had spent years researching vampire legal history, without, as far as we could determine, any direct connection to our world. What conclusion did you reach? That you were precise, thorough, intellectually honest, and genuinely interested in the material for its own sake, rather than for any practical application," he said, "which made you unusual. And then I met you and discovered that you were also considerably more formidable in person. Most people find me a bit much," she said. "I have been told that I care too intensely about things that other people consider dry. What other people consider dry is generally what is actually important," he said. "Documents, records, the written agreements that hold civilization together. I have watched enough of civilization collapse to have a very specific appreciation for anyone who pays attention to the parts of it that other people neglect." She looked at him across the table and thought about 600 years, about the weight of watching the world change over and over while remaining the same, about a black death in the 14th century and a young lord turned into something that had spent the following centuries carrying the memory of every person he had failed to protect. "She was doing well," Valentina said. "The girl from the alley. I looked into it through the human police liaison records. She is doing very well." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me that," he said. "I thought you would want to know." "I always want to know," he said. "There are so many people I did not save over 6 centuries. I never stop wanting to know about the ones I did." She thought about that particular kind of pain, the pain of a person who had loved and lost so many times that the loving and losing had become structural, built into the architecture of existence, and she felt something in her chest that was both protective and terrified, because she understood very clearly in this moment that if she continued in the direction she was currently moving, she would be adding her own name to a list of people that Malachi Dunraven would eventually watch leave the world while he remained. He seemed to understand what she was thinking about. She had learned, an unnerving ability to follow the path of her thoughts from very small evidence, which she attributed to 6 centuries of careful observation. "I am aware of the arithmetic," he said. "I do not ask you to ignore it. Then what do you ask?" "Nothing," he said. "I ask nothing from you. I am simply telling you that I have spent the last 4 months working out what I feel about you, and I have not been able to arrive at a conclusion that involves not telling you the truth of it." She set down her fork. "Which is what, exactly?" she said. He looked at her across the table with those amber eyes, and there was nothing diplomatic or managed in his expression, none of the careful composure she had watched him maintain through 3 days of formal trial proceedings. He looked entirely like himself, which was to say, complicated and old and dangerous, and more honest than anyone had any right to be. "I have been in this world for 640 years, he said. "I have known many people. I have loved some of them, though not so many as you might expect, because genuine love requires a particular quality of attention that is difficult to sustain across that much time. But I have never met anyone who walked into a room and made me feel as though something important was happening, until I turned around from that window and saw you standing there with your document case and your terrible suit." "That is my best suit," she said. "I know," he said. "I will take you somewhere to buy a better one." She laughed, which was not what she had expected to do, and he smiled, which was not something she had seen him do in the formal context of the trial proceedings, and the smile did something very specific to the temperature of the room. "I am not easy," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I will absolutely read all of your legal documents and tell you when you are wrong. I am counting on it," he said. "I am 31 years old," she said. "You are 640. That is genuinely unusual." "Yes," he said. "Everything about this is unusual. I have not managed to make it otherwise." She looked at him for a long time. This person who was both the oldest and in some ways the most honest individual she had ever sat across from, and she thought about the folder in her filing cabinet in Prague, and the letters she had sent that no one had answered, and the moment in a seminar room when a student had asked questions that had changed the direction of everything, and she thought about how history worked, about how the most significant moments were rarely the dramatic ones, but the small, undramatic choices made by individual people who decided to pay attention. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. He walked her home, which was not something she had expected, and which turned out to involve walking along the Southwark riverbank, with London lit up across the water in the particular way it was, after midnight on a clear autumn night. And she told him about the first archive residency she had done in Prague, the one where she had found the misfiled documents, and how she had spent 2 hours in a cold reading room, reading them alone, and feeling the particular specific electricity of finding something important that no one else had seen. He listened, and then he told her about the first time he had sat in the court chamber as a newly appointed duke, which had been in the late 17th century, and about how the political structures of vampire civilization had seemed to him then, which was to say both more and less comprehensible than what he had known as a human lord. Because the issues were fundamentally the same, But the timescales made everything both more significant and more tedious simultaneously. She asked him questions because she could not help asking questions, and he answered them, and somewhere between the Millennium Bridge and the South Bank Arts Complex, she had taken his arm without quite deciding to, and he had covered her hand with his, which was the particular temperature of someone who did not generate warmth in the ordinary way, but whose touch was nonetheless the most grounding sensation she had experienced in a very long time. They walked all the way to her flat, which was in a narrow Victorian terrace in Bermondsey, and she let them into the entrance hall and turned around, and he was standing in the doorway with her document case that he had been carrying since the court chamber, and he held it out to her with an expression that was both composed and, for the first time in all the months she had known him, slightly uncertain. She took the document case. "Come in," she said. He came, and she made tea, because it was what she did when she needed to do something with her hands while she thought, and he sat at her kitchen table and looked around her kitchen, which was full of books and papers, and a large pinboard covered in photocopied documents and handwritten notes, and his expression was the expression of someone encountering a space that was entirely legible to them, entirely recognizable, entirely right. "This is your working wall," he said. "The whole flat is a working wall," she said. "The bedroom is slightly better." Slightly. She set a mug in front of him, which he would not drink, and sat down across from him with her own, and they looked at each other across the small kitchen table in the late London night, and she thought about the 4 months of consultations and the 3 days of the trial, and the dinner and the walk along the river, and the fact that she was sitting in her own kitchen at 2 in the morning with the person she had spent 4 months not quite letting herself think about being here. "I want to continue doing what I do," she said. "The research, the teaching. I am not going to disappear into your world." "I would not ask you to," he said. "Your world is interesting. More interesting than mine has been in quite some time." "Your world is also interesting," she said. "It has considerably more material for research." "Then we are well matched in terms of resource exchange," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think we are." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand palm up and held hers with the same careful absolute certainty with which he did everything. And outside the kitchen window, London went on being London, and the night went on being the night, and she felt the steady particular warmth of something that was both completely new and, in the way of things that are genuinely right, entirely inevitable. The months that followed were not uncomplicated. The vampire court, having been deeply humiliated by the trial's outcome, was not warmly disposed toward either of them, and several of the more reactionary lords took pains to make their displeasure known through the usual channels of vampire political disapproval, which included formal social exclusions, whisper campaigns through bloodline networks, and one genuinely alarming incident. 3 weeks after the trial in which 2 hired vampires attempted to intercept Valentina outside her university building, she had not been harmed because Malachi had anticipated the possibility and had assigned Dorian and another vampire of his household to unobtrusive watch over her movement pattern without her knowledge, which she had discovered when Dorian appeared from an adjacent alley, moving faster than human sight could comfortably track, and resolved the situation before Valentina had fully processed what was happening. She had been extremely unhappy about both the attack and the undisclosed surveillance. "You should have told me," she said to Malachi that evening. sitting in the penthouse apartment with considerably more energy than the situation technically required. I am not a person who needs to be managed. I am a person who needs to be informed. You are correct, he said without defensiveness or qualification. I should have told you. I made a decision based on not wanting to alarm you, which was paternalistic and wrong. I apologize. She had been prepared for resistance, and the lack of it took some of the wind from her sails. She looked at him. Just tell me things, she said. I can handle things. I have been handling things my entire life. I know, he said. It is one of the things I find most extraordinary about you, and I used it as an excuse to treat you as though you needed less information rather than more. That was a betrayal of your trust, and I am genuinely sorry. She had sat down. You are very annoying when you are immediately and completely right. I have had 6 centuries to practice taking responsibility for errors, he said. It seemed like a worthwhile skill. She had looked at him across the room, this impossible, ancient, entirely aggravating person who apologized properly and meant it. And she had thought that she was going to be so thoroughly lost over this situation, and that being lost over it was something she had decided at approximately 2 a.m, in her kitchen several weeks earlier, to accept completely. The political situation required attention on a level beyond the personal. The court's humiliation over the trial had done something that Valentina, who had studied political systems for years, recognized immediately as a potential catalyst for backlash. Institutions that had been publicly embarrassed by their own procedural failures did not simply accept the correction and move forward. They looked for ways to reassert authority, and the most available way to reassert authority was to find a new angle of attack on the situation that had embarrassed them. The new angle, she determined after 3 weeks of careful monitoring of court communications through the network of human legal liaisons she had cultivated during the trial, was going to be a challenge to the Sovereign Compact's authority itself. There was a faction within the court, led by Lord Seraphon, and supported by Cassiveth Morn and 2 other senior lords, that was moving to pass a formal resolution declaring the compact dissolved on the grounds that it had been operationally inactive for over 2 centuries, which would retroactively invalidate the pardon and reopen the case against Malachi. She brought this to Malachi's attention immediately, accompanied by a 14-page legal analysis she had written in the 3 days since she had first identified the threat. He read all 14 pages without interruption, and then sat back and looked at her with the expression of someone who had just received very bad news, and was processing it with the particular efficiency of a person who had survived very bad news many times before. The resolution would require a supermajority of the court, he said. 12 of 17 lords, she said. Seraphon currently has 8 confirmed supporters and is working on the remaining 4. How long do we have? 3 weeks before the formal motion can be brought to the floor. 2 if he accelerates the timeline. What are our options? This was what she had been thinking about for 3 days, and she had arrived at several possible approaches, each with its own logic and its own costs, and she had laid them out in the document. But she had also arrived at one approach that was not in the document, because she had not yet decided whether to raise it. Option 1, she said, is to challenge the resolution on procedural grounds, which I can do. I know the court's procedural rules better than anyone in that building, and there are restrictions on how resolutions affecting compact-era legal structures can be brought forward. I can delay this for months. But not indefinitely, he said. No. Eventually, they find a procedurally acceptable path. Option 2? There are 5 lords who have not yet declared for Seraphon. If those 5 vote against the resolution, it fails. I have looked at their political interests and their historical positions, and there is a genuine argument to be made to 3 of them that validating the compact's authority is in their long-term political interest, because it establishes a legal framework that also protects certain rights and privileges they currently hold under compact-era grants. That is a better option, he said, but it requires those 3 to believe their long-term interest outweighs Seraphon's immediate influence. Yes. And the third option? She had been looking at her notes, and now she looked up. The Sovereign Compact did not dissolve when its last regent died, she said. Under its own foundational statutes, it enters a dormancy period without an active regent, but it can be reconstituted by a formal claim of compact authority from any individual who meets the qualifications for regent status. He was very still. What are the qualifications? He said. 300 years of vampire age minimum. A clean record under both vampire civil law and compact law. The ability to produce 2 witnesses to the formal claim. She held his gaze. You meet every qualification, Malachi. You could reconstitute the compact as its active regent, which would not only protect your own pardon, but would re-establish the compact as an operative authority that supersedes the court's jurisdiction in foundational matters. The silence stretched. You are describing a power consolidation of significant scale, he said. I am describing a legal mechanism that exists and is available to you, she said. I am not recommending it. I am telling you it exists because you asked for options, and I am not willing to withhold information from you. He was quiet for a moment longer. What do you think I should do? She had not expected him to ask that, not exactly. Not with that directness. I think the regent option is available as a last resort, she said carefully. I think it carries real political risk, because a significant portion of the court would view it as a power grab, regardless of its legal legitimacy, and that reaction could produce conflict that harms people beyond the 2 of us. I think we should try the political persuasion option first. I have also identified that one of the undeclared lords, Lady Ceravain Dusk, has an active legal interest in a compact-era land grant that she has been trying to enforce for 40 years and that Seraphon has been blocking. If the compact is formally recognized as operative, her land claim succeeds automatically. You did her legal research for her, he said. I did the research for myself, she said, and I happened to notice it. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to think of as his most honest face, the one that was neither duke nor political figure, but simply the person who had turned from the window on an afternoon 4 months ago, and seen something that changed the geometry of his world. Come with me to see Lady Ceravain, he said. She will listen to you. She will listen to the legal argument, Valentina said. Which I happen to have prepared. Yes, he said, and the warmth in his voice was the warmth of someone who was continually delighted by a specific person. You do. Lady Ceravain Dusk turned out to be a vampire of approximately 280 years, who received them in a townhouse in Mayfair that was decorated with the eclectic accumulation of 3 centuries of genuine aesthetic interest, and who listened to Valentina's legal analysis with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for exactly this information for a very long time. She agreed to vote against Seraphon's resolution before Valentina had finished the 3rd page of her analysis. 2 of the other undeclared lords followed, for their own reasons, over the following week. The 4th was persuaded by Malachi, through means of vampire political negotiation, that Valentina did not involve herself in, because she understood that some portions of this world operated according to conventions that predated her, and that she was not equipped to navigate directly. When Seraphon brought his resolution to the floor 3 weeks later, he had 9 supporters. He needed 12. The resolution failed. The aftermath was quieter than Valentina had expected, which Malachi explained was because it was a court faction that had overplayed its hand and lost preferred to retreat and regroup rather than continue a public confrontation it could not win. The threat did not disappear. It simply went dormant, and she understood that the regent option remained available, and that it was the reason the court, having lost twice to the same human lawyer, was now approaching the situation with considerably more caution. "They are afraid of you," Malachi told her, in her kitchen in Bermondsey on a Sunday evening in December. London cold and bright outside the window, and the flat full of the particular warmth of good tea and a heating system that worked adequately, and his presence which had become, over the weeks, something she had arranged her domestic space around the way you arranged furniture around a piece that you knew you intended to keep. "They are afraid of the legal tools," she said. "No," he said. "They have encountered legal tools before. They are afraid of someone who understands their world well enough to use those tools with absolute precision, and who does so not for money or political advantage, but because she believes it is right." She thought about that. "Are you afraid of me?" she asked. He looked at her across the kitchen table with those amber eyes, and the expression on his face was warm and open and entirely without defenses. "Terrified," he said, "in the best possible sense." She smiled at him, and he reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a touch so careful and deliberate that it was almost architectural, the gesture of someone building something that he intended to last. "I am going to continue researching," she said. "There are 3 other compact-era documents I have identified that may have significant implications for vampire civil law, and I intend to catalogue and publish them through academic channels, because that is the most defensible way to make them part of the formal record. And your university work." Continuing, "I have a new seminar in January, Early Modern Governance Structures. I expect the students to be very interesting." He smiled at that, the real smile, the one she had first seen at dinner, and which still did something very specific to the air around her when it appeared. "I would like to do something," he said, "that I have been considering for some time. What is it?" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a small box on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Malachi," she said. "I am aware," he said, "of every argument against this. The age differential, the practical logistics of an immortal and a human, the political complications, the fact that we have known each other for less than a year. I have considered all of them thoroughly. I have also spent 640 years learning to distinguish between things that matter and things that merely appear to matter, and I find that this," he touched the box, "is something that matters. I am still alive," she said, "for the next 50 or 60 years, assuming reasonable health. Yes, and after that you will not be." "No," he said quietly. "I will not be, but I will have had them, which is considerably more than I had before I met you." She looked at the box for a moment. She thought about a man turned in the 14th century who had watched everyone he loved leave the world while he remained. She thought about 600 years of accumulating a kind of love that had nowhere particular to go. She thought about a folder in a filing cabinet and an unanswered letter, and a student in a seminar room asking pointed questions. She thought about a document in a leather case carried from Prague to Vienna to a court chamber 60 feet below London, and the particular electricity of finding something important that no one else had seen. She thought about the fact that she had been, her entire adult life, a person who paid close attention to things other people neglected, and that she had spent a year paying very close attention to this specific person, and had found him to be, beneath 6 centuries of accumulated power and carefully managed distance, the most honest and genuinely good individual she had ever known. "Ask me," she said. "Valentina Moreau," he said, and her name in his voice had the quality of something he had been practicing for a while, and intended to say correctly, "I am asking you to be my partner, in whatever sense you find acceptable and meaningful. I am asking for the time you are willing to give me. I am not asking you to change what you are or how you live. I am simply asking you not to make me spend what time I have without you." She opened the box. The ring inside was not a diamond. It was a dark amber stone set in worked silver that was very old, and it caught the kitchen light and held it in the same way his eyes did. That amber and gold quality that she had been trying not to look at too directly for a year, and was now, she decided, going to stop managing. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He placed the ring on her finger with the same careful precision with which he did everything, and then he looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression of such unguarded happiness that it made something catch in her throat. Because she had read 600 years of court records about this man, and happiness was not an emotion that appeared in them with any frequency at all. And the fact that it was on his face right now, in her small kitchen in Bermondsey, felt like something that mattered in a way that exceeded any document she had ever found. She reached across and put her hand against his face, and he covered her hand with his and turned his head slightly. And outside the window, London was doing its ordinary London things, entirely indifferent to the fact that, as inside a narrow Victorian terraced house in Bermondsey, a human history teacher and a 600-year-old vampire duke were sitting at a kitchen table, and, in the quiet and uncomplicated space between them, finding something that neither of them had expected, and both of them had, without quite knowing it, been looking for all along. The winter proceeded with the particular quality of London winters, cold and bright, and occasionally beautiful. And life continued to be both ordinary and extraordinary in the way that it does when two people are building something real. Valentina submitted 2 papers to academic journals, one on the foundational structure of vampire civil governance, and one specifically on the sovereign blood compacts, legal history, and operative status, both of which were accepted and published, and caused exactly the kind of quiet professional disruption that serious academic work caused when it revised understanding of something that had been incorrectly established. She was invited to speak at a conference in Edinburgh and went, and Malachi drove her to the station and waited on the concourse than was strictly necessary after her train departed, which she knew because Dorian told her. She bought a better suit, navy with stronger lines, which Malachi observed with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been right about a minor thing and intended to accept, being right about it graciously, without making too much of a point of it. The court continued its operations in the underground chamber. navigating the new landscape in which the Compact's authority was formally recognized, and in which a human lawyer had twice successfully outmaneuvered its most senior members. Lord Seraphon remained chief arbiter and maintained his frost-pale courtesy when their paths crossed, which they occasionally did. And Valentina maintained her own precise professionalism in return, because she understood that sustainable arrangements required ongoing management and that the goal was not humiliation but function. Lady Seravain Dusk had her land claim resolved in her favor and sent Valentina a gift, a first edition of a 17th century European governance text with a handwritten note inside that said, with the particular directness of a vampire who had been alive long enough to see no reason to be indirect, that she was glad someone had finally read the documents. Casiveth Morn made no further moves against them, which Valentina interpreted as either genuine acceptance or tactical retreat, and did not much mind which it was, provided the practical outcome was the same: the archive residency that Valentina had applied for in Vienna, the one that would give her access to the remaining Compact-era materials she had identified as significant, was confirmed in March. Malachi arranged to spend the month in Vienna as well, in a house that was entirely his own, and not a hotel, which was the most vampire way imaginable of approaching the situation, and which meant that she had both a research base and somewhere to go home to in the evenings, and the evenings in Vienna that spring were something she did not find adequate language for, except to say that a city that had been beautiful and historically significant to her before became, that month, beautiful and historically significant, and imbued with a kind of personal warmth that made it permanently different every subsequent time she thought of it. In the Vienna archive, she found what she had been looking for, the final piece of the Compact's foundational legal structure, a document establishing the terms under which a new sovereign regent could call the Compact into full operative session, which required a regent and a minimum of 3 recognized Compact member bloodlines, and which, she calculated, reading in the cold archive room with her coffee going cold beside her, Malachi already had the standing to accomplish. She brought it home to the house that evening and set it on the table between them. He read it carefully. "You are telling me this is available," he said. "I am telling you this exists," she said. "The same way I told you before. You asked for options. I do not withhold information." He looked at the document for a while. "The regent role carries responsibility," he said. "Genuine responsibility. Not just authority. I know, it is not something to claim for political protection. I know that too. If I take it," he said, "I take it because there is work to do. Because the Compact was designed to protect rights that the court has been eroding for 2 centuries, and because someone should actually do the work of reconstituting that protection." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly the reason it should be done." He looked at her. "You would help," he said. "Not as a lawyer, as a partner. I am a historian who specializes in vampire civil governance and who can read primary sources in 6 languages," she said. "What exactly do you think I have been doing for the last 7 years?" He smiled and reached across the table and took her hand, and the amber and gold ring caught the light of the Vienna evening coming through the window. And outside, the city went on being beautiful. And she looked at him, looking at her, and thought about all the documents she had read, all the history she had studied, all the accumulated choices and actants and small important moments of attention that had brought her to this exact kitchen table in this exact city, in this exact company. She thought about a gavel coming down on marble, and a cage opening, and a man walking across a court chamber floor with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew where he was going. She thought about being told she was the most remarkable person in the room by a voice from a cage, and about responding without looking up, because she had needed to keep thinking. She thought about the moment she had finally looked up and what she had seen on his face, and she thought that she had known then, even as she had made herself look back at the chief arbiter and continue the argument even as she had maintained every professional discipline she possessed. She had known. She had been waiting for exactly the right moment. "All right," she said, "let's do the work." The formal reconstitution of the Sovereign Blood Compact took place in September in the same underground chamber that had hosted Malachi's trial, which was a deliberate choice that no one who was present failed to understand. Lord Seraphon presided because his role required it, and he did so with the frost-pale courtesy of a man who had made peace with a reality that he had attempted to prevent and failed. And Valentina sat in the advocates' gallery and watched Malachi stand at the center of the chamber and claim the regent's authority in words that were 600 years old, and that had never sounded, she thought, quite as alive as they did in his voice. The three bloodlines who recognized the compact's authority were represented by Lady Seravain Dusk and two others who had come to understand. Through the preceding months of careful legal argument and Valentina's published academic work, that a functioning compact was better for their interests than a court operating without any foundational check on its power. When it was done, when Malachi stood as the sovereign regent of the reconstituted compact, and the chamber acknowledged it with the particular formal silence of an institution adjusting to a new reality. He looked across the room to where she was sitting, and the look on his face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more specific than triumph. It was the expression of someone who had arrived at something they believed in. She gave him the small nod, the one that meant everything they had built together, all the work and the danger and the documents and the long evenings at kitchen tables and the conversations that had started as professional and become something that was the most important thing in either of their lives. He gave it back. She walked home through London in the September evening, the city brilliant around her, and she thought about the fact that she had a seminar to plan for Tuesday and papers to review and a conference presentation to finalize, and a meeting tomorrow with Malachi to go over the compact's first formal agenda, and a life that was hers and was also, now, thoroughly and irreversibly entwined with something ancient and extraordinary and entirely worth every moment of attention she had given it. She thought about the 14-year-old girl who was studying for her GCSEs and had no idea that a chain of events stretching from a Prague archive to a Vienna table to an underground court chamber had turned, in part, fact that she was alive and well and getting on with her ordinary life. She thought that ordinary life was, in the end, the thing that everything else was in service of. The documents, the courts, the ancient structures of power and law, they existed so that the ordinary life could proceed. And ordinary life was made of small, specific things, good tea, and a kitchen table, and someone who looked at you as though you were the most important thing they had encountered in 600 years. She turned into her street in Bermondsey, the narrow Victorian terrace that was entirely too small for a sovereign regent to spend any time in, which a sovereign regent had nonetheless become a permanent and deeply welcome presence. and she saw that the lights in the kitchen were on and that the particular quality of London evening light coming through the window was warm and domestic and exactly right. She went inside. He was reading at the kitchen table, an old text that she recognized as one she had pulled from the Vienna archive, a compact commentary from the early 18th century that she had been meaning to annotate for weeks. He had a pencil, which she had given him after he had tried twice to make margin notes in her copy with a fountain pen, and there were careful, small annotations in the margins in his handwriting, which was a very old-fashioned copperplate script that was both extremely legible and occasionally startling in its formality when encountered in a modern context. He looked up when she came in. She looked at him across the kitchen, at this impossible person, who was 640 years old and was sitting at her kitchen table, making careful notes in the margins of a history book in copperplate script, and wearing an expression of entirely unguarded contentment. And she felt, with the particular clarity of a moment, that she recognized as it was happening, rather than in retrospect, that this was the thing she had been looking for when she had started reading old documents in cold archive rooms, not the documents themselves, the truth inside them. "Come and look at this," he said. "There is a footnote in Chapter 7 that contradicts your argument in the second paper." "It does not," she said, hanging up her coat. "It does. Come and see." She came and sat beside him, and he moved the book so they could both see it, and she looked at the footnote. And she said, very clearly, that the footnote was citing a document that had been subsequently superseded by the 1743 Regency dissolution protocols, and he said that her argument in the paper had not been explicit enough about the temporal boundary, and she said that any serious reader would have understood the implied boundary from context, and he said that serious readers should not be required to supply information that the author had omitted. And she turned to tell him that his marginal notation on page 12 was grammatically incorrect, and found that he was considerably closer than she had realized, and was looking at her with the amber eyes and the warm, open, entirely unguarded expression that was still, after all these months, the most dangerous she had ever encountered. "You are going to tell me I am wrong about the footnote," he said. "I am going to revise the paper to clarify the temporal boundary," she said, "which is what a scholar does when someone makes a legitimate methodological observation." "That is the most gracious concession I have ever received," he said. "I am a gracious person," she said. "Occasionally, he agreed, and the warmth in his voice was the warmth of someone who knew her completely and found her completely, specifically, exactly right. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and outside the window, London was being London in the particular way it was on a September evening, vast and indifferent, and full of ordinary people doing ordinary things, entirely unaware that 60 feet below one of its cathedrals, the ancient structure of vampire civilization had just been given something that looked, for the first time in centuries, like genuine justice. She thought about the document in the leather case, the amber vellum and the sharp, dark ink, and the seal that had been waiting in a misfiled box in a Prague archive for 300 years for someone to come along and pay attention. She thought about how the most important things were always, in the end, a matter of paying attention. She had paid attention, and everything after that had been exactly what it was supposed to be.